Hi everybody and welcome to another piano video here on the Merriam Pianos YouTube channel. We're continuing our series of a dive into piano producing regions of the world, and today's video is all about China, one of the most dynamic and certainly the largest area of piano production anywhere on the globe. We're going to be taking a look at specific brands. We're going to be talking about the history of how piano developed inside China, as well as where things are headed. So thank you so much for joining us. If it's the first time that you are seeing us here on YouTube, we'd really appreciate if you hit that subscribe and notification bell. It really helps us out here. We love to hear those comments, and of course we'd love to see you back for more viewing and videos in the future. So without further ado, let's dive right in to a look at the Chinese piano industry right away. For somebody who has been closely observing this industry for close to 20 years now, there's no more interesting a country to take a look at than China. When I first became involved with the piano industry and the piano business, it was very easy to write China off in almost monolithic terms. Oh, that's the country that makes cheap instruments. They aren't very good. Almost everything coming in is Stencil branded, meaning that some importer has applied a sticker onto a relatively generic instrument, is now marketing it with very nebulous terms and completely bogus histories. Now, to a degree, some of that is still occurring, although I would say the standards of presentation have increased. That business model still has a few places here and there. But over the course of those last 20 years, there has been a dramatic transformation in what that country's capabilities of, as well as I think the standards that they're holding themselves to as well, has just simply shot through the roof. To the point where somebody looking today wouldn't even recognize what that industry was 20 to 30 years ago. It really has gone through a full revolution. And whereas you really could lump virtually all piano manufacturing into two categories 20 years ago, that being of instruments for domestic production that were being produced under really domestic nameplates, such as the early entrants like Pearl River. Hailun was still a relatively new beast at that point, but you had some of the older former government owned factories like Guangzhou and Singhai and Sejun that were still pumping out large quantities but relatively low quality of instruments for domestic production. And then the second camp were those that were doing it for export, but almost exclusively under the brand names of the importers in Europe and North America that were bringing them in. Now, looking at the industry, there really are three categories. This is, to me, three categories looking at these instruments, and it's completely different than it was before. You have the first category, which really is, I'm going to call them the organic producers. These are companies that originated in China. They were started and continue to be driven by Chinese ownership and Chinese innovation, and they are producing now not only for domestic China, but quite proudly under their Chinese trade name and their factory name for the rest of the world. So these are instruments that have really come about because of a very organic development in the domestic piano industry. And so there is a chunk of pianos that fall into that camp. Then we've got a chunk of pianos which I think on the opposite spectrum really still fall into the stencil category. Even though the overall standards of all pianos in China have definitely risen, the stencil category to me probably delivers the lowest value, although there are still some points of light in that category, and there's 5 or 6 prominent brands that fall into that. And then we've got a third category of pianos, and this has really taken off. These are true collaborations, true hybrid projects, where in a lot of cases you have European countries, or rather European companies, who have partnered with Chinese factories, or in some cases purchased older Chinese factories and reinvigorated them under their own name to produce lower cost but still very high quality instruments to augment their existing lineup. And you could pretty well slot all Chinese pianos now into those three camps. You've got your domestic sort of organic growth producers, you've got your Stencil brands, and then you've got these collaborative hybrid type pianos. Now, the history of piano making in China is also quite unique. The thing that always strikes me looking back through history and how piano interweaves itself through history is it's very easy to tell when Western culture has arrived in a country, at least certainly if you're looking at it from the lens of, say, the 1700s through to the 1900s. When the piano arrives, so arrives the rest of all of the Western baggage that goes along with it. Because until the arrival of, I would say, things like the automobile, which became the 20th century's status symbol for a lot of Westerners. Prior to that, it could be argued that a piano held that same type of status. And so people who owned pianos were often upwardly mobile and successful merchant class families. It was a sign of education and progressive forward thinking. If you had your sons and daughters, particularly daughters, educated on piano, it was kind of a sign of good grooming for marriage. And so the story of piano in China has a very similar tale. Now, how Western culture arrived in China happened over a much longer period of time, and it was sort of a gradual creep that was really fueled by a very active British merchant class that was doing business in and around Hong Kong and Shanghai, going back hundreds of years. Now, I think this was allowed to happen in China because there was a relatively weak central government that was really not able to stop or control these merchant forces from going in and doing business. And of course, this really came to a head with the Opium Wars, in which the Chinese finally tried with force to really put a cap or somewhat contain those British merchant forces, and particularly try to put an end to the drug trade. They tried to shut it down by force. The British retaliated with disproportionate force, and really began, I think, what the Chinese refer to it as the Century of Humiliation, which is just this series of trade concessions and border concessions, largely to the British, that implanted very heavy Western influence and interests in many of the port towns and border regions, trading regions in China. And so as this is happening, you have an import of Western influence and Western culture and Western music. And so the piano fed its way into there. During the kind of the early days of communist China and prior to the Cultural Revolution, so we're talking, late 1950s, 1960s, that time, the piano was seen again as a mark of a sharp mind, as a mark of a disciplined individual, disciplined citizen for the new People's Republic of China. Mao has some famous quotes talking about how learning to play the piano with all 10 fingers is analogous to learning to multitask and to really have the country unite in a complex series of new initiatives and new industrial growth policies, et cetera, et cetera. So the piano sort of arrived by that, but then, like many other places around the world, once it was there, the piano really was embraced. And became a significant part of musical study and culture in China. So let's get back to the instruments themselves and the brands themselves. So I mentioned these three categories. Let's go first through what I'm calling the domestic or the organic producers. There's a little known company named Schumann who actually got its start back in the 1950s. They're actually still operating, although they haven't been able to keep up to the scale of, say, Pearl River and Hailun. They still do produce instruments, and those instruments were, according to Schumann anyway, based on some of those early or traditional German piano designs. You don't hear too much about that brand, but it still is producing, you know, they've managed to pull their quality control up along with the rest of the country, and so you'll find it out there. I would say, as I said, one of the less prominent brands, but if you were looking for an example of a piano that genuinely had its birthplace in China with probably little influence from the outside as to where it is today, Schumann might be a really good example of that. Przina is another example of an instrument that has largely been of domestic Chinese product. Przina is a German brand, but the factory that Przina purchased several years ago by the businessman Ron Boll out of the Netherlands was already in existence. This was Yantai Piano Company, and now it's Yantai Przina. That factory is responsible for many of the designs that you see now on Przina's, the floating soundboard. The actions are entirely designed and built at the Przina factory. And I think Przina really was one of the first names that caught the attention of a lot of North American observers for its musical potential and capability. I think over the last 10 years, Przina has now been outpaced in a lot of ways by major advancements at some of those other larger companies that are doing a combination of both their own brand name production, but solidifying their business model by also producing for other companies. And you know, Pearl River and Hailun really are the two big ones that have pursued that type of strategy. Moving right on to those companies, we've got Pearl River, who obviously are the largest producers now in the world. You've got the Pearl River brand, their sort of medium premium brand, which is the Ritmuller stuff, and then more recently, I would say their high-end, well, they would certainly describe it as their high-end, the Kaiserberg stuff. Now, these are instruments that are starting to utilize very premium materials, very advanced scale designs, and the musical potential of these instruments is quite high. I would say in the best case scenario, you have musical potentials for the instruments which are really now on par with a kind of a typical Eastern European piano design, maybe even some of the lower end Japanese pianos, such as the Yamaha GC series or some of the Kawai GL series. Hailun is the same. Hailun is producing some great instruments themselves. They've also had some major collaborative efforts with some outside designers such as Emma Shigeru, Frank Emerson, Peter Valetsky, and a lot of these projects have produced improvements not just for the Hailun line, but for other lines that are building out of the Hailun factory, such as Wendell and Long and Emerson, which I believe is probably the most expensive piano that you can purchase out of China right now, totally in line with Eastern European piano pricing. Now, on the opposite end, I did mention that there were still a class of brands that I would consider stencil brands. And these are going to include names such as Hallett and Davis, Hardman and Peck, Cristofori, Nordheimer, Niedmeyer, Steigerman. These are names which really are owned by importers in various countries and distribution areas around the world. And it doesn't mean that they're at all inferior or bad pianos. But what it usually does mean is that these instruments and these brands are going to factories such as Pearl River, Hailun, Parsons, and are essentially contracting some of their less sophisticated models, but with very good quality control and a strong North American distributor to back up the purchase and reduce the risk. And then moving on to this third category of true collaborations and hybrids. And in a lot of cases, these are external companies that are already manufacturing in, say, the United States or Europe, and they are looking to augment their lineups with a third piano. And rather than just do the stencil thing, which is what happened for a couple of decades, they're actually investing in completely new designs, and in some cases even investing in personnel and equipment that are for their exclusive use to be in these larger Chinese factories producing instruments to not just the standards, but the specs and designs of these external companies. And these are the really interesting ones to me. So names that you're going to recognize out of these types of projects would be Fridolin. This is a Schimmel brand where it's a complete Schimmel design, and Pearl River is doing the building. You've got Essex, that's pretty well the same kind of concept. Steinway is doing the design, and Pearl River at this point is the one who's doing the manufacturing. Then you've got companies or brands such as Wendell and Lung that have kind of developed in tandem really with the Hailun thing. They're produced by Hailun. They're sold as a European brand, but there's still even some involvement from some of the original family of Wendell and Lung. And you've got, designers like Peter Walensky that has been really quite integral to the development of both that line as well as some of Hailun's other lines. We mentioned the Emerson a bit earlier. Then you've got Ritmuller, which is really the Blüthner family of brands foray into Chinese piano manufacturing. In this case, they actually just purchased a small factory, and they're doing quite a bit of their brand augmentation out of that factory with some of the Ritmuller products, and I think there's a few other brands depending on the market that are making various uses of that Chinese factory. You've got Brodmann, which is producing through Parsons. Parsons is a music retailer that's kind of become a retailer manufacturer in China, and Brodmann is a project that originally started over at Busendorfer, and then several former employees decided to pursue it as a Euro-Chinese hybrid project. When that original project unfortunately dissolved, they've continued the brand, but with certainly no direct European involvement. It's all Chinese, but they were able to preserve some of the designs, and now Parsons is producing that. You've got Zimmermann, which is a Bechstein project. These are pianos, particularly the newer S series uprights, the S2, S6, and there's two new Grand S series, where Bechstein has had significant involvement with the design of these instruments. And Bechstein actually cordons off a full production area and finishing area so that they have basically German quality control and finish, not just as a standard, but as a direct employee involvement right on the floor at the Hailun factory. Baldwin is another one where you had Baldwin, or Gibson, I guess is the parent company, pretty much fold up operations in the United States in 2008, 2009, and they now have Parsons manufacturing pretty good facsimiles of what their uprights were. The Grands aren't quite as close, but their top-end Grands, they've been able to achieve some of the tonal features of the original Baldwins. Where is the Chinese piano today, and how does it really compare to some of the other piano producing regions? Because there's no doubt that China has been on an upward trajectory, both in terms of its market share, but as well as the quality and the sophistication of those instruments. I use consistently the word musical potential rather than musical performance, and that's quite intentional because this has been my observation watching these instruments across a huge swath of brands over the last 20 years. The pianos that are now coming out of the very top projects, and I would say that those include projects that I just mentioned, like the Emerson piano that Hailun is producing. Some of the Zimmermann stuff is top-notch. Some of the Fridolin stuff is definitely top-notch. I would say Pearl River's own Kaiserberg products are really top-notch in terms of sophistication of design, and now more recently even the quality of the components that they're putting on there. But one of the things that is really difficult for a piano factory to nail, and this is some of the reason why German factories are often limited in their ability to grow, and this is where Japanese factories have been able to really excel, is having a large enough staff to engage in some of those very high-level finesse finishing operations that take a piano from about a 70% of realized potential to 100% of realized potential. These are activities such as voicing, Regulating is a lot easier to train. Voicing takes enormous amounts of time to get really great, and that needs to be a collaborative back and forth between your hammer manufacturing and the people doing the voicing to get the tensions right and understanding exactly how they want that felt treated. The other part of that is the hand craftsmanship that you need when it comes to tapering soundboards and really properly shaping and fitting bridges or fitting soundboards to the rim. These require very high levels of experience, and you just can't train a ton of people to be able to do that in a short period of time. That takes several generations of apprenticeship to really expand the capacity of your workforce that is trained at that level so you can be outputting these pianos. So the best way that I could describe the top output of China right now is instruments that in the right hands could be performing at a very similar level to many of the instruments out of Japan and Eastern Europe. The challenge is that those factories just don't have hundreds and hundreds of technicians that you'd need to do this to 100,000 pianos per year, sitting there voicing each instrument for 1 to 2 days, or sitting there shaping the hammers exactly properly, or being able to get in there after your sophisticated computer CNC milling machines have ground the soundboard down perfectly. Sometimes each piece of wood's a little bit different. You still need to get in there and sand a little area here, sand a little area there. It's that incredible level of finesse that takes a soundboard design and even the very best materials and elevates it into a musical instrument that has true levels of magic to it. Do I think China is going to get there? Absolutely. Do I think that a instrument, even a high-end instrument right now coming out of those factories, matches the same level of voicing and the same level of finish and final kind of tolerances that is coming out of the top instruments out of Japan, Western Europe, or even the United States? Simply not there yet, but it's going to be exciting to see where that goes. And of course, for enterprising buyers who truly understand that the raw goods they're getting out of the best projects in China now rival those of the top producing nations, and they have a great retailer they want to work with, or perhaps a concert technician that they have a great relationship with, the value in those particular cases could be quite extraordinarily high. We're going to finish off the video actually with a few more playing examples of some of the Chinese pianos that we've had a chance to review here on the channel. And by and large, those experiences have been quite positive. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you've enjoyed this look at the Chinese history of piano making, as well as where we are in the current industry. And if you'd like to subscribe, hit that button and the notification bell so that we can see you back for more videos in the future. My name is Stu Harrison. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you again soon.